This is Capital Games Movie Club. I am the Wiz.
And I'm Zero.
Zero, you decided. Was it? Did I decide this or did you? No, I decided this one, right?
Yep, you said you wanted to keep on going with action movies.
Got it. So, we did Black Adam the week before, and this week I decided to keep with the action theme to watch the Christopher Nolan 2020 film Tenet, starring John David Washington and Robert Pattinson. I'm wondering, I want you to go over, you're familiar with Christopher Nolan, correct? I mean, you said so in the last podcast. Am I right on that?
Yeah, I've seen Inception, and then, of course, the Dark Knight trilogy that he was behind as well.
Christopher Nolan is a director that is getting a lot of prominence. He's not only making a lot of money in his movies, which makes studios want to work with him, but they also are movies that are getting a lot of awards and a lot of acclaim. So even the movie nerds like me like him, which is kind of rare. I can't wait for him to become Spielberg when it's cool to not like him. But let's get past that regardless. He's had an interesting career for a while now. I got familiar with Christopher Nolan in 1999 in his in his independent film Memento. Do you know what Memento is about?
Yes, that one I haven't seen in a while, so I may need a little bit of a refresher.
Okay. Basically, he rose to prominence in this film. It's about a guy with anterograde amnesia, which is a guy who can't hold memories for more than 5 minutes. And the film is centered around him and him trying to find out who his wife's killer is. It is a great movie. I've seen it multiple times. It is a fascinating movie to watch. And if I were to give a top 3 of my favorite Christopher Nolan films, it would be Inception's 1, Memento's 2, and then The Prestige is 3. The Prestige is one that people seem to be mixed on, but I love that film for a number of reasons. He is a definite director where when he does a film, people begin to notice and want to watch it as soon as it gets out. Why we haven't gotten to watch Tenet until recently, I can't really answer that. But I'm glad we're watching this too, because this was a blind spot, and I did want to watch it whenever I get the chance before I went to go see Oppenheimer, which is coming out this year. So let us. What are your thoughts on Christopher Nolan's films? Anything that sticks out that?
Memento was fantastic, but I love the meme culture that spawned off of it, especially with the whole Polaroid photo with the writing on the bottom, "Don't believe his lies." I can't tell you how many times I've seen it used to hilarious effect in meme culture.
Yeah.
I think one of the best ones I saw was it had the Civilization portrait picture of Gandhi. And right under it said, "Don't believe his lies." I was like, "Oh my god, that's right!" Because Gandhi has a gag in Civilization where he builds nukes and he tries to start nuking everyone.
No, funny. Oh man, that is funny. Yeah, I like those memes too. Memento was not only one of the first independent films I saw in theaters. It was also one of the first films that did a special edition that I actually of a DVD that I really loved. When Memento came out with its special edition, what they did was they not only had the film remastered, they then re-edited the film in the correct order. It was interesting. It was one of those special editions that I really liked, and I wish more people would do. But let's get past Memento. We'll barrel past it. And we're going to talk about Tenet, the 2020 action sci-fi film. I got to tell you, Zero, if there's something that makes Christopher Nolan hard as fuck, it's time. It has to be. He must get a boner every time he wakes up in the morning and the alarm clock goes off. He must. Because this is now what? The fourth film he's done centered around time? Like, we have Tenet, we have Memento, we have The Prestige, we have Inception. You could debate whether The Prestige is about time.
Yeah, and Inception is more about psychology and how the brain works. So not really time, but
there is an aspect to it.
is.
Go ahead.
Yeah, there is a concept that time moves faster in certain stages of the dream world, but I mean, that's a kind of a tenuous link at best.
Oh god, Interstellar does the same thing. Oh my god. Yeah, like this guy must love time. He must, like, seriously, because that was like the first thing I was thinking about. It's like, oh, hold up a second. Another movie about time? Wait a minute. Not to get into spoiler territory already, but the main conceit of the film is that basically things happen in reverse in certain aspects of the movie, in weird ways. God, that really gets into spoiler territory, doesn't it?
Yes, it does.
Okay, so let me back the truck up here. Okay, so basically, Tenet is about this character called the protagonist, which, oh god, oh, okay, I'm gonna get through this. So the guy's name is Protagonist, played by John David Washington. Basically, he's involved in this secret world of sorts that is based in the real world, but is kind of like a parallel to the real world, I guess, is how this is getting confusing already. Holy shit. If you haven't noticed by this point, it is a confusing film at times. It is deliberately confusing throughout the entire film, but let me ask you this question, Zero. Did you feel like you had to watch the film again in order to get what was going on, or did you get the gist of it once you stopped the movie?
Fictional concepts of time fascinate me, so thankfully I didn't have to watch it a second time around. Once it got to the midpoint of the movie, that was when all the concepts started clicking into place. I was like, oh, okay, I get how this all works now. So right. It wasn't too bad for me.
Right. A lot of people were reportedly confused by the movie, in some aspects, a lot of people were frustrated with the movie as well because of it, because they want a lot of film goers, especially ones that, when they're advertised as from the people who made Inception and the Dark Knight trilogy, they're expecting a certain thing, and when they watched this movie, they were kind of puzzled by it and were very confused as to what's going on in this. So I expected, not to derivatively call them normies, but normie movie goers who like action and like a plot to be essentially digestible. We're going to have a really hard time with this film. I did enjoy the aspects of where the film goes, because even though it was confusing it was pretty confusing in the first half, when you start to see what happens towards the end, it really clicked for me what they did. And it's not like I loved it, but I did enjoy it. On the other hand, when you're talking about like the aspects of time in this movie, I've already said what it was about, so hell with spoilers on that. When it comes to the aspects of time in this, it's not like they're doing something profound in this movie. It's kind of well-worn territory, in my opinion, at least, to a certain. What do you think? Was there something in the film when it came to time that made you think, oh, they're doing something different here that I haven't seen before?
Not different. I think my piece that amazed me was just kind of the film editing and the fight choreography. Mostly because of just the time shenanigans that get involved with the film and everything.
Yeah. So we'll probably get into the deeper stuff in spoilers, which is where I think a lot of my issues lie. So let's just get into some other aspects of the movie. You mentioned fight choreography in this. Does the gunplay count to you as fight choreography in this?
A little bit, yeah.
A little bit? Okay. I did not feel so great about the fight choreography. And this will lead into spoilers as well, so I'll just say my piece on it. I was surprised there wasn't much impact in what was going on with the fight choreography. I know this is a PG-13 film, so there wasn't going to be much blood, there wasn't going to be much gore, there wasn't going to be a lot of violence in it. So, okay, fine. When it came to the fight scenes, it just seemed like more dancing than it really was fighting in this. And then when you get to the gunplay, when they talk about the different types of bullets and what they do, I was expecting a much more impact when those bullets were used than they were. They just seemed like standard bullets when they used the special bullets that we'll call them for now. in this. So I was kind of disappointed they didn't differentiate a lot of stuff, because it just seemed like, to a certain extent, it was the same. It just felt like the same thing. Like, look at I'm going to mention this again. Look at The Matrix, for example. When you're in The Matrix, certain things start happening that give more impact to what you're doing. There are the reverberations from when Neo hits a person, or there are sound portals coming out of the bullets when they come out on bullet time, things like that. I was kind of expecting more impact on those ends where it wasn't there in this. What were your thoughts on the choreography and the gunplay with that aspect in mind? Were you satisfied with that?
The gunplay was a little weak. I think the hand-to-hand fight choreography with the whole time shenanigans, I thought was interesting. It wasn't like extremely great choreography. It was just kind of visually interesting, especially when we talk more about the whole time thing that goes on in some of these fight scenes and everything.
Right. God, we can't really get more into it without going to spoilers, so I guess we got to move on. We got to move on. Okay. Direction, it is kind of it's good. It's a good-looking movie. It is standard Nolan fare. It is pretty dark. It's not really dark, but it's got a dark tinge to it, and it's very industrial feeling throughout the entire film in this, which isn't bad considering what the movie is about in this. When it comes to, I guess, Nolan's better directed films, it's good, I guess. I still think something like Inception is probably a lot better, but it was fine for what it was, I think. I didn't watch the film thinking, oh, this is a Christopher Nolan film, but it was fine to me.
This one sits kind of in a really interesting place because, for me, as someone who loves the sci-fi concepts of time and things like that, I thought it was a fun enough movie. But at the same time, when I kind of take that part of me out of the equation, I agree. It's just it's not better than Inception. But at the same time, it's one of those things that when I try to look at it from the lens of like a normal person, someone who might not be into sci-fi, someone who might not be into like psychologically interesting films like Inception, this kind of falls short in lights of something normal people enjoy, like the Dark Knight trilogy that Christopher Nolan did. So it's kind of in a weird place for me.
I try not to gauge my opinion on what I think other people might think of a movie to a certain extent, but you are right. People who were into like something like Inception, because the way Inception was edited and the way it was directed, even though it could be confusing, it clicks as soon as certain scenes happen of what's going on. And it becomes an immediately engaging, engrossing film because of that. I don't think this film has this in that aspect. And it might be due to what the film is about, to a certain extent, because with Inception, it was about dreams. So it's more ephemeral. You can have more creativity. You can do more with that subject. Whereas Tenet's about time, and you can only do so much with time without going into otherworldly theories and other things that are a lot more confusing to talk about without fully explaining them as the movie goes. Which I guess it would really depend on what your mentality is. I would see someone like you being a little more disappointed with Tenet and with the aspects of what they go through in this. Whereas maybe someone like me who isn't so much into time dilation and all the time weirdness and stuff, or the time theories, and maybe getting a little more out of it, saying, oh, that's interesting, yeah. But even then, like, to me, the time aspects of it, the aspects that they have in the film are interesting. I think half-baked is not what I want to come across, but I guess for somebody like Nolan who's done more intelligent films that made you think a little bit deeper about things, I was expecting more from this. Now, this could have made it a much more confusing film, which, fine, that can happen. But on the other hand, I just sat there. I think at the end I was kind of like, "That's it." Like that's all this is. Okay, it's fun. It's an interesting film to watch, but I didn't get that pull that Inception or The Prestige gave me. Like, I didn't get that from this movie. So that's why I'm a little disappointed by it.
This is something that I've just trained myself on, especially with critiquing media over the years and everything. I try to keep my expectations as low as I can, just so I don't, just fall into the trap of, oh man, this looks so good. I bet this is going to be just totally, totally awesome. And then just the film ends up being underwhelming and going, oh God.
Yeah.
Why did I hype myself on that? And I think that's why just my disappointment isn't as bad as it could be, but I can personally see why some of the time stuff could be a little disappointing and confusing, because they do take a lot of liberties on some of the interpretation of stuff. But I mean, time is kind of a nebulous concept, and I mean, there's not really a good tangible way to kind of detail it out in a way that everyone understands in some form or shape. And unfortunately, I think that is a bit of a weak point on the film, because just time isn't something tangible that most people understand. I mean, unlike in Inception, where just people dream, so people know, just kind of the weird and ephemeral nature that dreams have. But a concept like time, people just kind of look at it and go, okay, the hours keep on going forward, and I keep on getting older. What the fuck else is new?
See, your issue is not just the execution, but just that with how nebulous time is to a certain extent, it kind of treats it as something much more tangible. Is that where part of the disappointment lies?
A little bit. I think it's just more just I can see kind of like the pain points of just as trying to put time into a tangible concept. And because they're trying to put it into a tangible concept, sometimes it makes things just kind of feel rushed and hasty on the explanation on how it all works. And I think that in my mind is a potential pain point on where I could see why a lot of people may get very confused at this movie.
Right. And the problem with time travel stories and time travel movies is that everybody has a theory at some point as to what time and time travel will be at this point. At this point, when they digest certain media or certain theories about it. I remember Looper. I don't know if you remember this movie. It was with Bruce Willis and Joseph Gordon-Levitt. It was directed by Rian Johnson, and it was about time travel to a certain extent. And people had issues with that movie as well, with how they portrayed time travel. But the thing that I think a lot of people just forget about with time travel is that it's all theory at this point. So we don't really know. So what I get annoyed by with time travel movies is that with most time travel movies, you need to have a rule set as to what in this movie they consider is the right and wrongs of time travel. Some movies, when they deal with time travel, cheat on their own rules. And when they do that, that is when I get kind of like, they're not thinking about this too clearly in this, obviously. I don't think Tenet cheats on its rule set so much, but I think it made the rule set a little more vague, where it can get away with certain things in the movie that if the rule set was more defined than it was in other movies, that other movies wouldn't get away with. And I thought that was kind of cheap in this movie to a certain extent, where most movies, when they deal with time travel in any certain circumstance, they stick by those rules no matter what. Like, they deal with time paradoxes. They deal with the issues of if you meet yourself in your past, what happens, something like that. They have those rule sets in place. So, for whatever reason there is. This movie kind of goes into it vaguely in this. And I would debate whether it breaks the rules or not, but but that's also the squirreliness of the story to a certain extent. Like, the only way I looked at with direction is, did I have fun with this movie watching it? And yes, I did. But I think that's also kind of the disappointment. I wanted more out of it, and Tenet just didn't give me that more that I wanted with a sci-fi film like this, especially from a director like this.
I think really I kind of agree with you, just especially when I kind of heard the premise of Tenet was based on time, and I was just like, I really enjoyed the hell out of Inception, just really curious to see how this ends up playing out and everything. And of course, here I am just after watching it, and I'm just like, it's a fun enough movie, but it just does not have the punchy impact that Inception did.
Not even just the punchiness either, because it doesn't necessarily need the punchiness, but it has to have something that, like Inception, to a certain extent, had a mythos that if you really want to dive into it, you can dive into it more, and it'd be much more interesting. I don't see Tenet having that, because not only it kind of wraps the story up in its own way in the end, but it also doesn't leave enough tangibility on the offset to want to dive more into it. But let's move on. Let's get into performances of the movie. I'm curious what you think the highlight performance of the movie is. Who is the performance that you like the most?
Honestly, Robert Pattinson. I thought he was kind of fun as the handler and everything.
He was kind of charming in this movie.
Yeah.
But he is a very good actor. Unfortunately, he got famous with Twilight, and he had to work pretty hard to get people to realize he was actually a good actor because he was in Twilight, the poor guy. But yeah, he was pretty charming in this movie. I would have to agree on that one. Mine is Elizabeth Debicki as Kat. I think she is the only character in this. She really is the only character in this movie that you root for, or you have a tangible attachment to throughout the entire film as the film goes on. So I ended up liking her performance a lot. I can tell you whose performance I wasn't too thrilled with, and that's Kenneth Branagh. I don't know if I'm just getting sick of this trope, but British or American actors doing terrible Russian accents are getting on my nerves. Like, he's a fine actor. He's a very good actor. But man, can he not do a Russian accent.
Yeah, it was just kind of like, really? You guys couldn't hire an honest-to-goodness Russian to play the role? Jeez, come on.
No, I don't. Honestly, I don't think they could have. With the way that this was in 2020, so the Ukraine war wasn't happening. But even before then, there wasn't a lot of Russian people interacting with the U.S. at all. So that does not surprise me a little bit. But there are other actors that I think that can pull those accents off pretty well, and it just seems like Branagh is not one of them. And I like Branagh in most of his work, but I just was, whenever he was on screen, I was like, it's like, oh shit. I mean, that's my thoughts on Branagh. What do you think of John David Washington's performance? I'm really curious about your opinion on this.
He was all right, but just with kind of how vague his role was, in combination with how vague the rules of the time travel stuff in this movie was, it just kind of came off as I guess a bit of a vague role. I mean, it all gets cleared up by the end, but I mean, by that point, it's just like, okay, well, yeah, it is the end. Everything should be kind of wrapped up with a bow on top, but at the same time, it's just like, you've kind of left us in the dark about this character on what role they play and what their part as as a piece on the chessboard is.
Well, his name is literally the protagonist. Like that. Yeah. When I look at IMDb right now, I'm looking at John David Washington, and the name of the role is protagonist. That's all it is. Yep. So it is a deliberately vague performance. So I get that to a certain extent. What I was surprised by is how they made him out to be a fish out of water type of performance. Because throughout the entire film, he is in these grand halls that are filled with opulence and a lot of beautiful people in beautiful suits and this and that. And he, in a place where he is filled to the brim everywhere of opulent, very sophisticated people. He acts very not very. I'll clarify that. He doesn't. It's not that he acts unsophisticated, but he is very direct and to the point in everything that he does. And for the performance itself, it's fine. When it comes to the overall world around him, I was very surprised that he got in to where he was, bearing in mind that he looked so out of place in all aspects of the world itself. It was more about the character and just how, not gruff, but like direct. He was dealing with a lot of people that, again, are very opulent, that like to self-aggrandize, that like to overinflate their egos and their importance. And when you deal with a lot of people like that, and you are more direct and to the point, they tend to not like those type of people. I guess that's another thing with the character that I didn't really get, and I think that kind of it unfortunately hampers Washington's performance in an unfair way, because he does the job, but I think the story had that issue where I had to believe that he was charming and smooth enough to get into these types of circles, and at no point did I believe it at all in this. But again, maybe we can get the spoilers as to why that fits in a certain way. But in this aspect, I didn't buy that part.
They really kind of play up the whole fish out of water thing a lot. I know one of the scenes that it's very apparent, and how they almost kind of bludgeon you straight in the face with it, is when he meets Michael Caine's character, Sir Michael Crosby, and just Sir Michael Crosby's just going through all the details of, oh well, if you're meeting Kat, this very refined art dealer who basically works at an auction house, your Brooks Brothers clothes, they're not going to cut it, man, and maybe polish up on your manners, on just how to play the game and everything,
right.
And then of course when you get to the end of the scene, of course just the steward ends up bringing over the protagonist's food and everything, and of course he's just like, all right, well, I guess I'll go to a tailor and get some nice clothes fitted and everything. And of course steward's got the food in hand, and of course again just the protagonist being a kind of direct person that may seem maybe unrefined or maybe even uncouth to a degree to these people who are definitely more used to opulence. He ends up asking them, hey, can you box up all the stuff you just made for me? And of course they're just kind of sneering at him going, no. And then he's just like, okay, never mind.
Yeah, I mean, but I'm thinking about it now, in an aspect that's actually not a bad character moment for John David Washington's character in this.
Yeah.
To a certain extent. I don't know. I sat throughout the entire film wondering, just with his directness, how he actually got into the situation. And I don't think the film does a great job doing that, unless it was just through Crosby in that, or Crawley, or whatever his name was, Michael Caine's character. Maybe that's the thing I'm missing. But at no point did I believe that at certain points that someone that direct can convince a lot of these people that they're worth his time. I think that's the one thing in this movie I'm like, I don't buy that. John David Washington's performance isn't bad though, but I just think the way that the writing took his character, I think, in that aspect was the problem in this, because he didn't come off as smooth or charming. He became, I would say, direct, maybe a little gruff. But then I think I liked that character that way. It's just that the movie did not connect as to how this type of character was able to get these type of sophisticants, or I would call them snobs to a certain extent, how he's got these snobs to want to even bother with him at this point. So that's like the only issue that I saw throughout the film with in regards to his character in that. Okay, so we're going to get into spoilers for Tenet. If you haven't seen the movie, you can stop here and come back after you've watched. We're going to get into spoilers for Tenet in 5, 4, 3, 2, 1.
So let's start with this, with the overarching theme.
Okay.
So basically, the overarching theme of the movie is that there are two timelines. There's a timeline that goes forward, which is just through the product of regular entropy. But then there's also this whole concept of inverted time, where time flows backwards and all the rules of entropy are completely reversed. Mm-hmm. So what is hot is now cold. What is cold is now hot, etc., etc., etc. And I mean, the game tries to illustrate this concept in the beginning, when the protagonist goes to the Tenet organization's office in like this big facility, and she's got like this chunk of wall, and of course she's just like, okay, well, pick up the gun and, you know, aim it at the wall, and, you know, just try to shoot the wall. And then of course, in this instance, just instead of just the bullet going out of the gun, you've got the bullet going back into the gun. And it's just like, okay, neat. So this is where we're starting.
Right. And when they talk about the invertedness of these aspects, they also say how there is much more impact, and it hurts a lot more, and it's a lot harder to help somebody who has hurt the impact of an inverted bullet throughout the entire movie. They say that in the beginning of the film, especially with the protagonist and the character from the Tenet organization is trying to have him explain that, all that stuff and everything. So that's why I was very disappointed with how the impact of those bullets and how the fighting was, because they made it clear that if you're hit with an inverted bullet, it fucking hurts. Like, it is supposed to be debilitating. And not only did they not show how debilitating it is, but when a certain character gets hit with one, it's like it didn't hurt her that bad at all, to a certain extent. Like, I guess at one point in the film, one of the characters gets hit with an inverted bullet in a not great place that could cause a lot of harm. But they explain that away, that they're able to help her, even though in the beginning of the film they said that it's really hard and almost impossible to do so. That's where I was, the rule set is where, when I mentioned the rule set, is where I think Tenet falls apart a little on this, because they established that getting hit with an inverted bullet hurts so much more and is much more deadly, and that they have that scene where it could be that it's potentially deadly, and they kind of wish it away a little bit. Do you know what I'm talking about?
Yeah. It was one of those things that also kind of tripped me out too. I was just like, okay, well, you've, for the most part, been really good with adhering to the defined rules for this movie, and one of the big rules that you mentioned is just being hit with something like inverted bullets is intensely painful, and then yet you and even to a point that, you know, they even mentioned, hey, you know, just anyone who's usually hit by these is usually probably a goner at this point, because just the damage is so severe, because, you know, these bullets are also potentially radioactive too. So, you know, just there was this whole lead up, and then of course you've got Kat who gets shot by one towards the latter half of the movie, and it's just like okay, yeah, I get that it sucked, but all of a sudden you're breaking the rules, going, but it's all good, we can save her, we just have to, you know, go through the turnstile and, you know, go through the inverted timeline, and everything will be fine.
Yeah. And on top of that, not only is she fine, but she's able to do one of the key things in the movie to get the plot rolling. She's not only made it, but she's then a principal a character in the whole heist that happens at the end of the movie, which is like, wait a minute. And they also show it, like, at the end of the movie too, where she reveals to the villain that, and I guess we're at spoilers, might as well say it. The villain is the one who shot Kat, and the villain is Kat's husband in the movie, so which is Andrea. When she reveals that she's the version of Kat that he shot in the stomach, it's like, okay, like, shouldn't she be dead by now? But she's fine. She's perfectly fine. And she dives into the ocean, and like, it was like one of those things where I'm like, oh, okay, I thought these were a big deal when you got hit. And here is this woman who is breaking the rule that is established in this as well. So yeah, that aspect I was like really about. Let's get into the action set pieces. So there are 3 key scenes in the movie. And what they do in these scenes is they not only, you get to watch these key scenes in the forward time, but then as the movie goes along, you revisit those scenes in backwards time in certain aspects. The scene with the plane is, I think, the one that I think is a good example of that, where you watch the initial scene where they're trying to get into that hangar, and then when they go back to it, it's actually them who is trying to get back in there in another scene. And it turns out, the big spoiler is that the protagonist is fighting himself in past time at a certain point, which is neat and all, but it was kind of like, it wasn't more like, oh, this is so thought-provoking. It was like, isn't this cool, huh? Isn't it? Huh? Like, that. It didn't seem very thoughtful to me. It didn't seem very interesting. It was kind of like a more of a, yeah, isn't it cool that we did this? Like, what do you what did you get out of that scene specifically?
So on the first go around, when we're looking at it in forwards time, some of the editing and cinematography was visually interesting, mostly because like you see movements that normally would not be something normal in like just a forward moving action scene. Like you see kind of like the inversion of a backflip and stuff like that. It's visually very, very interesting, but I mean, it's not, but at the same time, it's not like intellectually interesting, I guess is what I'm trying to say.
It's cool stunts. It really is, but and I'm going to use The Matrix again, but that's where something like The Matrix, it's not only visually appealing, but it's also intellectually interesting, because you're looking at it and go, oh wow, like when it comes to like bullet time, where Neo is bending the world to his whim to dodge these bullets, and intellectually you get what's going on, and then you get a bigger attachment to it. Whereas Tenet, it's just like, okay, he's doing flippy dippy flips, and he's doing crawling on his back backwards and stuff, because it's all in reverse. And I just sat there going like, that's interesting. I mean, it's fun to look at, but at no point where I was like, God, how do I put this? This was a movie, I think, if somebody were to spend more time building a world around it, that I think would have really benefited from it. Maybe, I hate using this excuse, maybe if this was more of a TV series or a series of films, or something that would have a much more defined, not only rule set, but a lore book, where you can have a backstory and everything around it to make the world itself more interesting. What they tried to do in this film was basically, there is the world we live in, and there's the world these people live in. And it was a rich-poor corollary to a certain extent, that in the beginning I thought would have been interesting, but by the end didn't work. Like, they forgot all about that corollary at a certain point, and then just said, oh, it's all about time. I think visually and just watching the film, it's fun, but this isn't a film that I would want to watch multiple times to see if I get little bits and pieces out of it. This is like a one and done for me. And I think that was kind of the more disappointing part of Tenet, in that is that the lore behind it and everything behind it was kind of threadbare. It was kind of thin. Whereas much more interesting films that deal with these types of things have more involved in it than I think Tenet was, which is what I found very disappointing by the end of the movie.
It's definitely a little bit of a sad thing that it's just not very intellectually deep, especially when one of the main principal rules that they establish way early in the movie just gets broken in kind of a Deus Ex Machina sort of moment. It's just like, okay, I guess God is in the machine doing things that we don't understand, so sure, why not?
Yeah. And this had the potential to be a very interesting and intellectually engaging film, but it just seemed like at this point they were more worried about action set pieces and how they looked than what it meant in a deeper sense. Which, again, it's fine, it's entertaining, but it's certainly disappointing to a certain extent.
Kind of back on the whole fight choreography stuff being visually interesting. I think some of the hand-to-hand combat stuff that was kind of where some of the stuff really shined, especially like in the Ford's moving version of the events that happened in the Rotas storage facility, where you've got what looks like just kind of a gun flying back into a hand and being reassembled in hand and all that other stuff. It was visually interesting, and then of course when you get to the part where everything is in inverted time and you see just kind of the opposite of things happening, a gun being knocked away from a hand, a gun being one of the characters being disarmed, and also the gun being taken completely apart from the slide and receiver. Just it's kind of interesting to kind of see both perspectives of the fight. But again, I mean, while it's visually interesting, it's not very impactful because you don't have some of the fun cinematography tricks that and probably to a light degree some CG tricks that you had in the Matrix. But also in the same go, again, it's visually interesting, but it's not intellectually interesting either.
So I think someone will point out when we're talking about impact with these fight sequences that other fight movies or that have very intricate fight scenes don't always deal with impact. There is grace, and there is with some movies, especially movies that you are into, Zero, that deal less in impact and more in the choreography and I guess the quote unquote dance of it. There will be movies like Hero. There'll be movies like Crouching Tiger, Hidden Dragon. There would be a movie we saw, Shadow. Films like that don't necessarily have the fights as impactful, but as very elaborate, almost dance-like moves, where the films are more engaging in that way than they're more impactful, less breaking bones and more about finesse and style. And I know people are going to point this out, and I'm going to answer that right now, and by basically saying that if that were the case, if Tenet was supposed to be more of a finesse fighting movie than that, I think these stunts would be a little more elaborate than they were, and they wouldn't place an emphasis on the fact that if you get hurt by an inverted bullet or hurt by somebody who's inverted, it hurts more. You would expect that impact. Whereas in this movie, and I might be to a certain extent downplaying the choreography a bit, but it seemed much more flippy and a lot more dancey than it really was fighting in that way. Because you look at Crouching Tiger. Okay, you know what? I'll even go down further. Let's look at Shang-Chi. Okay, let's look at Shang-Chi, a movie from the Marvel universe that deals with much more finesse fighting. I think I think the fighting in Shang-Chi was better than I think it was in Tenet, even with Tenet's special effects and the way they did the time stuff. Because the fights were a lot more, not just impactful, but were much more exciting. I'll put it that way then, for people that may have not seen Hero or Crouching Tiger. What do you think it is? Do you think it was more of a finesse film or an impact film, or is it a mix of the two that they didn't get right? What is your thought?
Didn't get things right. I mean, again, kind of like you mentioned, just being hit by someone on the inverted timeline is, in theory, supposed to be much more impactful. you don't really have that in some of these fight scenes. And again, just kind of some of the visually neat things. I can definitely see where some of the fights almost kind of feel too much like an over-scripted dance, and I can definitely see where that comes along too. So, yeah, it's just one of those things that I don't think it nailed the balance correctly.
I really don't think so either. I think the gunplay without the impact was pretty decent. I think the beginning scene in the opera was I think that might have been the best sequence of the movie, to be completely honest. I think the opera scene was probably the best one. And that's kind of disappointing, because they didn't get into the interesting stuff in the opera scene, but it was interesting as it is in the end. But okay. What about the reveal that the protagonist was the one that started the entire thing in the first place? I thought that was kind of cheap, to be completely honest.
I was gonna say I'd be inclined to agree.
Yeah, the whole thing of basically what happens at the end is, first off, there's no grand reveal as to who, because they always ask in the movie, who does Neil work for in this movie, and Neil is very cagey to say so. And then when it's finally revealed who he works for, it comes off like a lead balloon. It's not literally this grand reveal like, oh my god, it was the protagonist all along. It was Neil saying, oh yeah, it was you, bro. Like, what? I'm like, wait a minute, what? That's all? And when the protagonist realizes it, and that and that leads to the end of the film as to what happens at the end, it just was like, really? That's how you reveal the big twist? I guess it's not really a big twist, which is also the other problem I have. Because with this type of film, I mean, it's kind of a played out thing too in time travel stories, where the person that is going through all the time travel shenanigans ends up being the person that got the person into the time travel shenanigans in the first place, because the theory is that whatever happens already happens and you can't change it no matter what, which is, again, another mind bender to a certain extent. But it is also incredibly played out to a certain extent with time travel movies.
Yeah, it's just kind of a, wow, that's kind of anticlimactic. Great. Especially when they get more and more on the nose about it towards the end, especially just when you see Neil's backpack in the site, where just the protagonist is trying to get in and get the entire algorithm device away from being thrown into a storage capsule to be sent to another time and everything. And of course, then just when the protagonist goes, yeah, tell me who you are and everything, and of course Neil puts on the backpack, and what do you see? You see the red string charm on his backpack, like the one on the dead guy, out in the nuclear site, and then that's when you get kind of the reveal, just hard dropped on your nose again. It's just like, yeah, man, just you're the guy who started this whole thing.
Yeah,
it's like, oh, thanks.
Wouldn't it have been more interesting for people to figure that out on their own? But then that would require the lore and the background behind it to be much more in depth than it really is. On top of that, I think that just expands on what I think is probably the more disappointing thing about the movie, is that the backbone behind it, where I think there should have been a whole other world or a whole other thing that is much more interesting, that has much more depth to it, just isn't there in this, which makes the film a lot more disappointing in this. Like, I would have rather, honestly, heard someone's theory on this than the movie to then point out, oh, guess what? I'm like, okay. Sure, okay, dude, thanks. Like, like, that's how I feel about it, is when I saw it, I was like, really? That's how you're doing this? Like, I would have rather have been the end of the film, me still thinking, but wait, who does Neil really work for? Like, I would have rather had that than to have him say, oh, guess what, dude? You're the guy who did it. Bye! I'm like, what? It's like, okay. It's just another disappointing thing about the movie. I am more disappointed in this movie than anything, even though I'm going to end up giving it a recommendation. There is so many things about this that could have been much better that I think they kind of out of it. Let's get into our final thoughts on Tenet. Zero, why don't you go ahead and tell us your rating and your final thoughts?
Probably say it sits at a solid 7.5 out of 10. Again, just it's not going to be a very intellectual movie like Inception, but it's also going to be one that will be complex to follow for people who just aren't sci-fi fans, which would likely have this film overshadowed by something like the Dark Knight trilogy for folks who are kind of into just mainstream cinema and stuff like that. So it's not a bad movie, but it's not a great movie either.
I agree. I would give it a 3 out of 5 stars. I guess it'd be 6 out of 10 on the scale you're using. I think it was fun. It was interesting to watch. I enjoyed my time watching it. But there are aspects of this film that are disappointing. I think that the lore behind it's half-baked, and I think that if there was more time or more depth put into everything behind the film, like the algorithm and all the other aspects of the film, I think you would have had a much more entertaining, much more interesting film. But as is, it's fine. I would recommend it. It's a good 2 hour and 30-minute movie that is just engaging and fun to watch. But I wanted more out of it than it was giving, and I end up being disappointed on that end. So if you just want to watch a fun movie, I can give you better, but Tenet's not bad. But other than that, if you're expecting much more, especially when you're considering it's a Christopher Nolan film, you're going to be disappointed. So I would give 3 out of 5 for Tenet.